No labor laws, no days off. Life during the arduous Industrial Revolution era. This is not a horror story pulled from someone's imagination. This is what actually happened. This is the world that built the one we live in today, and the price was paid in blood, sweat, and the stolen childhoods of thousands who never had a voice. Thomas Whitfield was 10 years old when he first stepped through the iron gates of Hargrove Cotton Mill in Manchester. It was March, but the cold felt like January, and the boy's thin wool shirt did nothing to shield him from the biting wind that swept through the cobblestone streets at 4:30 in the morning. His mother, Eleanor, walked beside him in silence. She held his hand, but her grip was loose, almost apologetic, as though she knew she was delivering him into a place no child should ever enter, but had no other choice. Eleanor was 31, but she looked 50. Her face was gaunt, her hair streaked with grey, and her back was already beginning to curve from years of labour in the textile sheds. Her husband, George, had died the previous winter, not from disease, not from an accident at the docks, but from sheer exhaustion. He had worked 19-hour shifts 6 days a week at the Bridgewater foundry, and one evening he simply sat down on the factory floor during a brief pause, closed his eyes and never opened them again. The foreman had his body removed within the hour, and another man was working his station by morning. There was no funeral fund. There was no sympathy. There was only the rent, which was due the following Monday. So when the overseer at Hargrove Mill told Eleanor that her boy could start as a piecer, tying broken threads on the spinning mules for 2 shillings a week, she nodded without hesitation. 2 shillings would not cover bread for the week, but it would keep them from the workhouse. And the workhouse, as everyone in the slums of Ancoats knew, was worse than death itself. Thomas walked into the mill and was immediately swallowed by the noise. The clatter of looms, the grinding of gears, the hissing of steam. It was deafening. The air was thick with cotton dust that floated like snow and settled on everything, clogging the nostrils, coating the tongue, filling the lungs with every breath. The floor was slick with oil and water, and the heat inside, despite the cold morning outside, was suffocating. Hundreds of workers moved between the machines like ghosts, pale, thin, expressionless. The overseer, a stout man named Mr. Crail, grabbed Thomas by the shoulder and pushed him toward a row of spinning mules. "You see those threads?" he said, pointing to the machinery whirring at eye level. "When one breaks, you crawl under and tie it fast. If the mule catches your hand, that's your problem. If you're too slow, I'll make sure you learn to be faster." He held up a leather strap, and Thomas understood the lesson before it was taught. That first day lasted 14 hours. Thomas crawled beneath spinning machinery dozens of times. His knees bled through his trousers by noon. His fingers, small and nimble, were precisely why children were preferred for this job. But they were also fragile, and by the end of the day, 2 of his fingertips were raw and swollen. He was given a 10-minute break at midday, during which he ate a small piece of bread his mother had wrapped in cloth. He ate it standing, because sitting down meant risking not getting up again. Around him, other children worked in the same days. Some were as young as 7. A girl named Nell, who worked the next row, had a bruise across her cheek that she made no effort to explain. A boy named Arthur, who was perhaps 12, had only 3 fingers on his left hand. He had lost the other 2 to a carding machine 6 months earlier. There had been no doctor. His mother had wrapped the stumps in rags, and he was back at work within the week. This was not unusual. This was every single day. There were no safety regulations. There were no inspections. There were no laws that said a child could not be worked to the bone from before sunrise until after dark. Factory owners operated with absolute impunity, and the workers, desperate and disposable, had no leverage, no unions, no representation. If you complained, you were replaced. If you were injured, you were discarded. If you died, the machine kept running. Eleanor waited for Thomas outside the mill gates that evening. When she saw him, limping, filthy, his eyes red from the cotton dust, she pulled him into her arms and held him tightly. She did not cry. She had forgotten how. But something inside her chest tightened in a way that would never fully release for the rest of her life. Thomas looked up at her and said, "Is it always like this, Mum?" She paused. Then she said, "You'll get used to it, love. But Thomas Whitfield would not simply get used to it, and what happened next inside that mill would change everything, not just for him, but for every soul trapped inside those walls. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because stories like this, the ones history tried to bury, are the ones you need to hear. Subscribe now, so you never miss a single one. 3 weeks passed, and Thomas's body began to adapt in the way that only a child's body can, not by growing stronger, but by learning to endure pain without acknowledging it. His knees developed thick calluses from crawling. His lungs learned to breathe shallow in the cotton-thick air. His ears stopped flinching at the noise, but his spirit, still young and still aware, could not be so easily numbed. He noticed things. He noticed that Mr. Crail struck the smaller children more frequently than the older ones. He noticed that the girls were given fewer breaks. He noticed that when a child fainted from heat or hunger, the overseers would splash water on their face and push them back to their station. He noticed that the factory owner, Mr. Arthur Hargrove, visited the mill floor once a week in a fine wool coat, walking between the looms with his hands behind his back, never making eye contact with a single worker, as though the hundreds of human beings powering his fortune were no more significant than the gears in his machines. One afternoon, Thomas witnessed something that cracked the thin shell of acceptance he had been building around himself. A boy named Samuel, who was 8 and worked the floor below, got his arm caught in a belt drive connected to one of the main shafts. The scream was unlike anything Thomas had ever heard. Sharp, animal, absolute. Workers nearby froze. The machine did not. By the time someone managed to disengage the belt, Samuel's right arm was shattered in 3 places. Bone was visible through the skin. Mr. Crail walked over, looked at the boy writhing on the oil-slicked floor, and said to the nearest adult worker, "Get him out. He's done." 2 men carried Samuel out of the mill. There was no stretcher. There was no doctor waiting. His mother, who worked in the adjacent shed, was not informed for another 2 hours. By then, the arm had already begun to swell beyond recognition. A local barber, not a surgeon, would later amputate it on a kitchen table with nothing for the pain but a rag soaked in gin. Thomas could not sleep that night. He lay on the straw mattress in the single room he shared with his mother and stared at the ceiling, where water stains spread like dark maps of unknown countries. He kept hearing the sound of Samuel's scream. He kept seeing the bone. And for the first time, a question formed in his mind that was not about survival, but about justice. Why did no one stop the machine? Why did Mr. Crail not care? Why was a child's arm worth less than 10 minutes of lost production? He began to talk to the other children, quietly during the brief midday breaks, while the overseers ate their bread in the office upstairs. He talked to Nell, who told him she had been working since she was 6 and had never attended a single day of school. He talked to Arthur, the boy with 3 fingers, who said his mother was too afraid to complain because they would both be thrown out and sent to the workhouse. He talked to a girl named Mary, who was 13 and already coughing blood, the early signs of what the workers called mill fever, a slow death sentence from years of inhaling cotton fibers. Their stories were all the same, different names, different faces, but the same crushing machinery of poverty and exploitation, grinding them down day after day after day. It was around this time that a man appeared at the edge of Thomas's world. His name was Robert Ashworth. He was 26 years old, a former mill worker himself, who had lost 3 toes to a spinning jenny at 13 and had somehow clawed his way out of the factories and into a position as a clerk for a local printer. Robert had become involved with a small but growing group of reformers who were beginning to challenge the absolute power of factory owners. They held meetings in the back rooms of public houses, spoke in careful whispers, and distributed pamphlets that most workers could not read. Robert began visiting the areas around the mills, talking to workers after their shifts, and one evening he found Thomas sitting on a wall outside the factory gates, too exhausted to walk home. "You look like you've been through a war, lad," Robert said. Thomas looked at him. "Just a regular Tuesday," he replied. Robert sat beside him and asked about conditions inside the mill. Thomas told him everything, the hours, the beatings, Samuel's arm, the cotton dust, the children fainting. Robert listened without interrupting. When Thomas finished, Robert said, "What if I told you there are people trying to change this? Not tomorrow, not next year, but trying. Thomas stared at him. I'd say they'd better hurry. That conversation planted a seed, and seeds, as history has proven, are the most dangerous things that tyrants can allow to grow. Meanwhile, inside the mill, conditions did not improve. They worsened. Mr. Hargrove, facing increased competition from newer mills in Leeds and Birmingham, demanded higher output. The shifts were extended by another hour. The breaks were shortened. The overseers, under pressure from above, became more brutal. Crail began using a technique that workers called weighting, tying iron weights to the necks of children who were falling behind, forcing them to carry the extra burden as they worked. It was not punishment for misbehavior. It was punishment for being human, for having bodies that could not keep pace with machines made of iron and steam. Thomas watched. He endured. And every Thursday evening, he found his way to the cellar of the Crooked Nail, where Robert Ashworth's quiet words kept that small flame alive. If this story is making you feel something right now, anger, sadness, disbelief, drop a comment and tell me, what part hit you the hardest? I want to know. Robert Ashworth began coming to Ancoats every Thursday evening. He would meet Thomas and a handful of other workers, some adults, some barely older than Thomas himself, in the cellar of a run-down tavern called the Crooked Nail. The cellar smelled of damp stone and old ale, and the only light came from 2 tallow candles that sputtered and swayed with every draught. Robert was not a radical. He was not calling for revolution. He was calling for something far simpler, and in many ways far more threatening to the powerful. He was calling for acknowledgement. He wanted Parliament to acknowledge that children were being destroyed in factories. He wanted the public to acknowledge that the wealth of the nation was being built on the broken backs of its youngest and most vulnerable citizens. He wanted factory owners to acknowledge that a 10-year-old working 14 hours a day was not labor, it was cruelty. Thomas listened to Robert speak and felt something ignite inside himself that he had not felt since his father died. It was not hope exactly. It was closer to defiance. A small, stubborn flame that said, "This is wrong, and I will not pretend it is not." But defiance in 1830 came at a cost that most people could not afford to pay. Word reached Mr. Hargrove that some of his workers had been seen talking to a known reformer. Hargrove was a pragmatic man. He did not rage. He did not threaten. He simply called Mr. Crail into his office and gave a quiet instruction. Find out who is involved and make examples. The following Monday, 2 adult workers who had attended Robert's meetings were dismissed without pay. Their families, with no savings and no recourse, were facing the workhouse within the week. The message was clear. Association with reformers equaled destruction. But Thomas was not dismissed. He was too young to be considered a real threat. Instead, Mr. Crail began singling him out. Extra hours, harder tasks, longer stretches without breaks. When Thomas stumbled from exhaustion one afternoon, Crail struck him across the back with the leather strap so hard that the mark was still visible 3 days later. Eleanor saw it when Thomas changed his shirt, and her face went pale, but she said nothing. What could she say? What could she do? Thomas told Robert about the firings, about the strap, about the fear that was spreading through the mill like a sickness. Robert's jaw tightened. "This is what they do," he said. "They make the cost of speaking so high that silence becomes the only option most people can afford. But Thomas, and listen to me carefully, silence is what they are counting on. Silence is the foundation their empire stands on. The moment enough voices break through, that foundation cracks." Thomas carried those words with him into the mill every morning. He repeated them silently as he crawled beneath the spinning mules. He repeated them when Crail raised the strap. He repeated them when he saw little Nell collapse from exhaustion and get dragged to her feet by her hair. Then, in November, something happened that changed everything. A journalist named Edward Langley, who worked for a Manchester newspaper sympathetic to the reform movement, gained access to Hargrove Mill. He posed as a potential investor and was given a tour of the upper floors, the clean, well-maintained sections that Hargrove showed to visitors. But Langley did not leave when the tour ended. He slipped away, found a staircase, and descended into the lower floors where the children worked. What he saw there would haunt any man possessed of a conscience until his final breath. Children, some so small they could barely reach the machines they were operating, working in suffocating heat, covered in cotton dust, many bearing visible injuries. He saw a girl no older than 7 asleep on her feet, swaying beside a loom that could have killed her in an instant. He saw a boy with bandaged hands feeding raw cotton into a carding machine. He saw the leather straps hanging from the overseer's belts. Langley published his account the following week. The article ran on the front page and spread across Manchester, then to London, then to the halls of Parliament itself. Mr. Hargrove attempted to have the paper shut down. He failed. The words were already out, and words, once released into the world, cannot be recaptured, not by money, not by power, not by threats. Robert read the article aloud at the next Thursday meeting. When he finished, the cellar was silent. Then Thomas, 10 years old, scarred and exhausted, stood up and said, "So now they know. What do we do next?" Robert looked at him and smiled for the first time in weeks. "Now," he said, "we make sure they cannot look away. If you're watching this and you feel this story deserves to be heard, type in the comments, 'Every child deserved better.' Let's fill this comment section with that truth and make sure no one scrolls past without understanding what happened." The publication of Langley's article did not bring immediate change. History rarely works that way. What it brought was attention, and attention in a society that had built its prosperity on willful ignorance was a dangerous and destabilizing force. Mr. Hargrove attempted to discredit the article. He invited local politicians to tour the mill, the clean upper floors, of course, and issued a public statement declaring that his workers were well treated and that the journalist had fabricated his account to sell papers. Some believed him, many did not. The damage had been done, not because one man had written words on a page, but because those words had confirmed what thousands of people already knew in their bones, but had been too afraid or too powerless to say aloud. Robert Ashworth seized the moment. He organized a public meeting at St. Peter's Field, the same ground where just 11 years earlier, a peaceful protest had been met with cavalry charges in what became known as the Peterloo Massacre. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Over 300 people attended: factory workers, their families, sympathetic clergymen, a handful of doctors who had treated mill injuries, and even a few members of Parliament who had begun to see that reform was not merely moral, but politically necessary. Thomas stood at the edge of the crowd with his mother. Eleanor had not wanted to come. She was terrified of losing her own position at the textile shed, terrified of being seen, terrified of the consequences. But Thomas had looked at her that morning with his father's eyes and said, "Dad died because nobody spoke, Mum. I don't want to die the same way." And Eleanor, for the first time in years, did not choose silence. Robert spoke from a wooden platform. He did not shout. He did not curse. He spoke with the calm precision of a man who had been rehearsing this moment his entire life. He described what children endured in the mills. He named factories. He named owners. He read from testimonies that workers had secretly given him, including words from Thomas himself, though he did not use the boy's name. When he finished, the crowd was silent, not with indifference, but with the kind of silence that comes before something breaks. A doctor named William Hartley took the platform next. He described the injuries he had treated: crushed fingers, severed limbs, lungs destroyed by cotton fiber, spines curved from years of stooping beneath machines. He held up a child's shoe, small enough to fit in one hand, and said, "This belonged to a boy who lost his foot in a power loom last month. He was 9 years old, and his working life is already over, while the man who owns that loom dines on roast beef and sleeps in a featherbed. Tell me, what civilization permits this?" The meeting was reported in multiple newspapers. Petitions were drafted. Letters were sent to Parliament. And slowly, painfully, with the grinding pace that social change has always demanded, the wheels began to turn. In 1833, the Factory Act was passed. It was not everything the reformers had fought for. It was limited, it was poorly enforced in many areas, and it applied only to textile mills. But it established for the first time in British law that children under 9 could not be employed in factories, that children between 9 and 13 could work no more than 8 hours a day, and that factory inspectors would be appointed to enforce these rules. It was a crack in the wall. A crack that, over the decades that followed, would widen into reform after reform, eventually reshaping the entire relationship between labor and capital in the industrialized world. Thomas Whitfield was 13 when the Factory Act became law. He left Hargrove Mill on the day the first inspector arrived and took a position as an apprentice to a local carpenter, a trade that Robert Ashworth had helped arrange. His hands, scarred and calloused far beyond his years, learned to shape wood instead of tie threads. His lungs, already weakened, never fully recovered, and he would carry a cough for the rest of his life. But he carried something else too, the knowledge that his voice, small as it was, had been part of something larger. Eleanor lived to see her son grow into a man who stood upright, both in body and in principle. She never fully escaped poverty, but she escaped the mill, and in her later years she would sometimes sit by the window of the small house Thomas eventually rented for them both, watching the smoke rise from the factories in the distance, and she would say quietly, to no one in particular, "It's getting better. Slowly, but it's getting better." And it was. Not because the powerful had chosen mercy, not because the system had corrected itself, but because ordinary people, exhausted, frightened, beaten, had decided that silence was a price they were no longer willing to pay. The Industrial Revolution built the modern world, but the hands that built it were small, and the cost, measured in childhood stolen, bodies broken, and lives extinguished before they had a chance to truly begin, is a debt that history can never fully repay. All it can do is remember, and all we can do is make sure we never forget. Thomas Whitfield's story is not famous. You will not find his name in textbooks, but his story is the story of millions, and if you listened to it, truly listened, then a part of him lives on in you now. And that, perhaps, is the only justice that time can offer. If you watched until this moment, then you understand why these stories matter. Se você assistiu até aqui é porque gostou desse caso. Deixe comentário dizendo "I watched until the end", para que eu possa te conhecer e saber quem realmente gosta das histórias aqui do canal. If this story made you feel something, anything, hit that like button and let the algorithm know this kind of content deserves to be seen. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who takes their rights for granted, someone who has never thought about the children who paid for the world we inherited. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now, because every week we bring back the stories that history tried to silence, and you deserve to hear every single one of them.